if you look at the fundamentals of this conflict and the positions of the two sides, they are simply so far apart that no amount of diplomacy, no amount of leverage, and no amount of pressure tactics is going to bring the Russian and the Ukrainian position to a point where they can actually agree on a long-lasting deal.
Well, Michael Carpenter is a former senior director for Europe at the US National Security Council and served as US Ambassador for Security and Cooperation in Europe under President Biden. Good evening to you, Michael.
Good evening.
We've had lots of positive signals coming out of the White House and indeed from President Zelensky. But I wonder what you made of the comments there from the former head of the British Army, Lord Dannatt, saying that he actually doesn't think that we are really going to get to a proper full ceasefire in Ukraine.
Well, I very much agree with that. I think if you look at the fundamentals of this conflict and the positions of the two sides, they are simply so far apart that no amount of diplomacy, no amount of leverage, and no amount of pressure tactics is going to bring the Russian and the Ukrainian position to a point where they can actually agree on a long-lasting deal. I mean, let me just remind your listeners that President Putin has demanded from Ukraine not just Crimea, but which he already controls in its entirety, but the other 4 oblasts of Ukraine, which he controls in part. He wants those to be ceded to Russia in their entirety. He also wants a pledge that Ukraine will never join NATO, that no NATO forces will ever deploy to Ukraine, which rubs up against your previous discussion about a European force deploying to Ukraine. And then he also wants a cap on the size of the Ukrainian military such that no security assistance can flow to Ukraine to enable Ukraine to reconstitute its armed forces. That is something that for Zelensky is pure capitulation. And he will never agree to that. And no Ukrainian leader will ever agree to that because the Ukrainian public simply won't have it.
Well, I mean, we had those positive signals tonight. Of course, that is just talking about a partial ceasefire in terms of attacks on energy infrastructure. I mean, even if that is agreed, that would leave President Putin free to continue to carry out attacks on civilian targets, presumably.
Well, we'll have to see the ramifications of what exactly this cessation of strikes agreement on, at least on critical energy infrastructure. It's not clear to me whether that applies to all critical infrastructure, including such things as hospitals and power plants. Well, power plants presumably would be covered by the energy moratorium, but how wide that is, we'll have to see. This is probably something that Zelensky welcomes anyway. Russia and Ukraine had a sort of a tacit agreement not to strike each other's energy complexes in the past. For example, in the winter of 22 to 23, there were very few strikes on energy objects. But that fell apart, and the last year, certainly, of war has revealed dozens and dozens of cases of attacks on both sides on their energy infrastructure. So, you know, that could be a sort of a partial truce. But as you say, on the front lines, it's unlikely that that Putin will relent. And let's recall also that Ukraine is mounting active military operations inside of Russian territory in the Kursk region of Russia. And surely Putin will not countenance that and therefore will not agree to a full ceasefire anytime soon, in my opinion.
Where do you think this goes then? Because you talked about some of those demands that President Putin has made, claiming those 4 different provinces of Ukraine, a demand that there are no foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, and indeed a halt to all foreign military aid to Ukraine. It doesn't sound as though President Trump has been prepared to stand up to President Putin and say, look, that's unacceptable.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, thus far, all of the leverage has been applied to only one side of this war, and that's to Ukraine. So President Trump has cut off intelligence support and cut off military assistance, which then he restarted when President Zelensky agreed to the 30-day ceasefire proposal from this administration. But that had a grave effect on Ukraine. And contributed to significant Russian gains precisely in the Kursk region, where the Ukrainians were essentially operating blind without any intelligence. And President Zelensky, of course, he has said positive things about the Trump proposal because he is desperate to ensure that the United States continues to provide that intelligence and security assistance that he so vitally depends on, and which, frankly, very few European nations could backfill in the near term. Perhaps on the security capabilities side, but much less so on the intelligence side.
Where does this leave then Keir Starmer's efforts to try to get together this coalition of the willing for a future potential peacekeeping force? We've got that process being pushed ahead tomorrow. The defence chiefs from some 30 countries meeting to discuss how this might work. Do you think it's actually premature for the British Prime Minister to be pressing ahead with this when there's no peace to keep, and when the Russians have said that they are implacably opposed to any such force on Ukrainian soil?
Yeah, I think it's a valiant effort. I support it. I think it would be great if a coalition of European nations were to deploy, for example, military trainers to Ukraine as a first step. To have forces on the ground that they could then mobilize to expand and create a peacekeeping mission, as you say. But to me, it is just absolutely implausible that Putin or anyone in the Kremlin would ever agree to a situation where you have European forces in Ukraine. So if this is going to be part of a larger, just and lasting peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia, it just simply the Russians will never allow that to be a part of it. Again, it's useful to discuss how Europeans can mobilize now to provide some comfort to Ukraine, to provide perhaps trainers that can serve as a first incremental step in a multi-step effort. But frankly, this is not going to pass muster in a negotiation.
Well, there's so many different aspects to all of this. I wonder what you make then of the fact that just as Keir Starmer is trying to work very closely with President Macron and others to get this force together, we are hearing that the EU is getting together this big multi-billion euro fund to try to help countries across the European Union rearm, which is something that even President Trump has said that they need to do. Britain has made its own announcements on increased defence spending, so has Germany. But now we're hearing that the UK is going to be excluded from this fund when it comes to defence contracts. They're only going to be going to EU countries. I mean, presumably that's not only not going to go down very well in Britain, but it's not going to go down very well with President Trump, is it? Who's going to want some of those contracts for US defence firms?
Well, that's right. I mean, currently the EU procures about just under 2/3 of its military equipment from the United States. U.S. defense manufacturers, the prime companies, make an absolute killing in Europe. And that's about to change because President Trump has already announced that there will be additional tariffs on the EU coming into effect on April 2nd. And of course, the EU will apply its own retaliatory countermeasures. And so we're looking at the prospect of a real US-EU trade war in the very near future. What the Europeans do with their defense industrial base is likely to sharpen the fence around investment in Europe and procurement and leave it to European companies to be able to sell to European governments. And if that excludes the UK, that is an unfortunate collateral damage of this sort of decoupling of the transatlantic relationship that we're witnessing in real time right now. It's one thing to exclude American companies because of a trade war and because of souring relations, but the UK is actually strengthening and improving its relations with the EU. So European leaders would be wise to look at how they can create some sort of carve-outs for UK industries that want to sell to European governments.
I mean, Britain does have a lot of defence expertise and defence capability as well that you would think that EU countries would want to have access to.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, companies like BAE Systems and many others, Rolls-Royce, which produces plane engines, and so on down the list, are heavily embedded in defense industrial supply chains. And so creating, again, a sort of a wall, an artificial wall between the UK and the rest of Europe is frankly unwise. But I mean, this is something for Prime Minister Starmer to obviously take up with his European colleagues. I suspect there could be some sympathy to the argument that the UK should be included in the European Defence Industrial Strategy, which is a document that they've been toying now with for well over a year. But again, I think the primary impetus is to exclude the US and to buy European. If the UK can be branded as European, then so much the better for the UK.
Just finally, one of our listeners here on Times Radio, Helen's got in touch, says, what would Putin do if Europeans did put peacekeeping forces into Ukraine? I mean, she raises that prospect, doesn't she, as to whether peacekeeping forces, which would likely include British forces, could actually be directly confronting and perhaps come under direct attack from the Russians.
Well, that is the million-dollar question, and everybody who contemplates sending forces into Ukraine has to grapple with this. I served in the Biden administration where, often the administration was criticized for too carefully considering escalation risk. But when you have a nuclear power like Russia engaged in heavy combat in Ukraine across a vast territory, where they are firing missiles and drones and rockets literally at every single part of the country from east to west, north to south, this is a real consideration. So President Macron was the first to propose the idea of trainers in Ukraine. I think under his conception, these trainers would not be subject to an Article 5 clause if they were somehow attacked, either wittingly or unwittingly. But clearly, this is something that European governments have to grapple with. What if there are casualties on the ground after they deploy? Will there be retaliation? What will that look like? What will the cost imposition policy look like at that point? So these are real questions that Europeans have to grapple with. But for Ukraine, they're crucial because without Europeans on the ground, President Zelensky will simply not trust any agreement, given the number of times that President Putin has reneged in the past on various agreements, not just dealing with Ukraine, but dealing with European security, dealing with the war in Georgia, dealing with arms control, so many different agreements. I mean, the Geneva Conventions, which he's violating almost every day in Ukraine with various war crimes and documented crimes against humanity.
Michael Carpenter, former senior director for Europe at the US National Security Council, who's also former US Ambassador for Security and Cooperation in Europe under President Biden. It's been great to have your insight. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.